It's time to check your money with America's Money Maven, Vicki Brackens. Vicki Brackens is the president of Brackens Financial Solutions Network, LLC, and a registered representative of LPL Financial, member SIPC. Vicki, we have a special guest in the building.
Yes, we do, George. Today we're honored to have Assemblymember Pamela J. Hunter, who is, as you know, the Assembly District 128 representative. I'm thrilled that she has agreed to join us today, because I know that from all the things that she has been working on over the last, since 2015?
Yes.
There are many, many things that we can learn from her that are going to be applicable to some of the conversations that we've been having here on America's Money Maven. So Assemblymember Hunter, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
And she's actually my representative. So.
I am.
Oh, you didn't slip that in on me. Okay, now you've known for weeks, okay, that she was coming.
Yeah, I did not, but I had to fully disclose that now.
Okay, all right then. Well, as far as we all know, but I just want to make sure, because since this is broadcast across the state, in fact, across the country, that Assemblymember Hunter grew up here in upstate New York. She served in the U.S. Army. She was honorably discharged with a Commendation Medal and 2 Achievement Medals. After her military service, she received her bachelor's degree in business administration from Strayer College there in Washington, D.C., with a concentration in human resources and computer information systems. Also, okay, you represent, I understand, one of the most diverse districts in the state, both suburban, rural areas, and the Onondaga Nation, which includes the southern tier, eastern portions of the city of Syracuse, DeWitt, where you are, Mr. Kilpatrick.
Hello.
Onondaga and Salina. Okay. But I can't believe that it's been really since 2015 that you started your career here as far as the New York State Assembly. I remember you, okay, I'm going to go back a little bit in history, George, when you were, I believe, the chief of staff for Syracuse Community Health Center, is where we first crossed paths. Is that correct?
I did. I worked at the Syracuse Community Health Center in a couple of different capacities. When I first started working there, I actually worked in human resources. Obviously, that's my background in human resources, and worked on the defined benefit plan for the community health center, something that kept us in touch quite a bit, and also elevated and was responsible for public and government relations for the community health center, which is, it's interesting. Human resources is inside marketing sort of, and government relations is outside marketing. So
right. Well, George, here's where all 3 of our careers dovetail, because I don't know if Assemblymember Hunter knows that you were in banking as your beginning career.
That was where I first cut my teeth.
Okay. And as you know, for the last 35 years, financial services and in insurance and investment planning has been my career. And we dovetailed, as she said, in the defined benefit area as far as pension planning when she was at the Syracuse Community Health Center. But it really leads to where you are today, because you were just recently appointed as the committee chair on banking.
Yes.
And after serving as a committee chair on insurance. And I know that there are probably a lot of people who are on listening to us today who don't really understand what a committee in the Assembly really does and what the role of a committee chair is. So if you wouldn't mind, could you take a few moments and educate us here on those 2 subjects?
Sure. Sure. So there's a couple of different tracks in the assembly, the leadership track and the chairmanship track. So before I was appointed to be the chair of banks, I actually was the majority conference chair in leadership. And so I was responsible to kind of pull all of the majority conference together. And we, had conversations on policy, issues, facing the state, budget issues, lots of different issues. So leading that conversation, I was elevated to the position of the chair of banking. I actually have been a committee member for the insurance committee for the past 7 years.
Mhm.
And so it's broad experience in the financial services arena in the state. So the chairmanship has about 30 committee members in it. The majority of them are majority members, meaning Democrats, and then the rankers and the minority members, which would be Republicans. And it's my responsibility to lead the committee in introduction of bills that come under the banking committee. So it could be bills relative to public banking, public banks. It could be relative to credit, financial institutions, anything that has to do with either state chartered banks or any kind of financial institution that's not federally chartered.
Okay.
Cool.
So I want to kind of go back and summarize a couple of things, make sure we pinpoint some things. The committee's role is to bring legislation. Is that correct? To the floor?
Correct.
All right. How do you decide what type of legislation is brought to the floor, though?
Well, it has to be part of the state banking law. So it has to be in the Constitution under a regulation under the banking law. And we have really smart people that are lawyers, that it's not me, that look and see if someone introduced, and it doesn't have to be me that has to introduce a piece of
Okay.
legislation that's under banking. It could be any member,
Mhm.
but it is decided if it falls underneath a regulation under the banking statute, under New York State statute. And if it does, then it's assigned to the banks committee, and then it would be me to determine if that legislation would be able to move forward. We hold it. Sometimes lots of bills don't get reported through committee, which is a consternation of mine for many bills that I introduce, but for others as they're trying to get their bills through committee.
Okay, Arden. So the chair's role really is to make sure that everything falls under the banking regulation as far as the banking law is concerned. So the banking laws that have the most impact for citizens across the state of New York, are there 2 or 3 or certain ones that you key in on?
Well, there are, but it all depends on something that the chair can submit. If we're talking about public banking, that's something that the chair has always carried, or it could be something that's introduced, as I said, from other members. There is a separation between laws that legislators myself introduce and regulators, that is the Department of Financial Services, that they themselves can oversee and make modifications outside the parameters of state law.
Okay. So this is a joint responsibility between regulation or regulators and the assembly. Is that correct?
It's the Assembly and Senate. There, I have a counterpart in the Senate. So we have our 3 branches of government, and any bill that I introduce, the Senate has to have the exact same bill, vice versa. And then the governor would have to sign it to become law. But the person who works underneath the governor in that executive branch is the superintendent of the Department of Financial Services. And so sometimes what they want may be different than what myself in the legislature wants. And that's where sometimes there's a clash.
That's where the sausage gets made.
This
Right.
is sausage. They keep talking about this sausage, George. I thought it would make a lot of sense for us to kind of open up the sausage a little bit for our listeners and viewers, so that they can understand more of what that process
Vicki,
is about.
let me ask
Yes.
one more question. When I'm hearing you, does community reinvestment and things like that fall under your committee? as
It
far as
all
what?
depends on if it's part of banking. That might be an economic development issue. So that might be, in economic development committee. If it's relative to community development, financial institutions, that would be under, banking. If we're talking about banking, business districts, that would be, under banking. And it really is fine to sometimes bills have to be re-reported to a different committee because maybe it doesn't fit to the right committee. So maybe like what you're talking about, you would assume it's banks, but it may actually be in an economic development piece of legislation.
Mhm.
Okay, all right. So George, thanks for asking that additional question, because we want to make sure that we hit all the high points while we have our representative and chair here with us. You mentioned working with the Senate. So that is going to be Senate Banking Committee Chair James Sanders. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. He was here in Syracuse and we met him for,
Yes.
briefly a couple of years ago, just as the pandemic was starting. So I was wondering, how often does the Senate and the Assembly, as far as the committee chairs, get together? Do you co-sponsor bills or what happens exactly?
It's not necessarily co-sponsorship. It's kind of parallel, where I would introduce and sponsor a bill and he would introduce the same as in his house. And sometimes they pass bills that we don't pass, and vice versa. And there is a, collective. I've worked with James for the past 7 years on many different bills, because you can introduce bills that don't have to be in your chair responsibility. I have many bills outside of banking, but we'll introduce many program bills, for banking as well. There are some combined hearings that happen between the Assembly and Senate, especially finance committee meetings, when we get ready to get the budget presentations going. But many times it could be just an assembly hearing or a joint assembly hearing with different committees. But there are opportunities to work together.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered enough of the sausage, George. Let's get down to some of the meat. Okay?
Let's go. Let's go.
All right.
Let's make dinner now.
Let's make dinner. Oh, thank you, George. Okay, let's make dinner now. So there are a couple of issues before us that I think we want to make sure we cover today, and one of them has to do with understanding the issue of the unbanked or underbanked. Would that fall under your department?
Yes.
Okay. What do you really see across the state as being the primary reasons or primary concerns or challenges around the unbanked or underbanked?
Many times it could be not being a documented resident, and they are not able to participate in conventional banking, opening a traditional bank account. Some people have credit issues and don't have regular income. And so they use maybe non-traditional methods of banking. It could be check cashing locations. We've seen many people with this boom of online banking, where you don't necessarily have to go to a brick and mortar bank to take care of your transactions. You really don't even need to go into a bank to cash a check. You can use your phone and deposit it right into your account. But there are many people in rural areas that don't have opportunities for banking. Maybe it's just because they have transportation issues and can't get there. But normally it really is around populations of people who are impoverished and or populations of people of color. And those could include undocumented folks or immigrants as well.
Okay. Is that a big issue for the state of New York? It's
a huge issue, outside where we live in central New York, that the issue of folks being undocumented is not necessarily a high issue, but there definitely are issues for folks who don't necessarily have the requirement to open a bank account, whether it's a social security, card and number and a license identification to be able to just go in and say, I want to open an account. Maybe they may have some sort of identification to let them cash a check at Tops. They could go to the grocery store and get their check cashed, but really outside of the system, be able to have all of the services that a bank can provide, getting loans and different kind of financial planning, products that banks can provide, that they're outside the scope of that. And in New York City, very large population of people that may be, undocumented, and they need to be able to, have the same opportunities others have for banking. And that's why, there's a lot of predatory lending. There's a lot of situations where they use, these maybe corner store check cashing, services, because they need access to money. And many times they're also using these locations to send money back home to where they're from. And there are a lot of fees associated with that.
So the issue of not being part of what I would call the established banking system possibly leads to loss of wealth, loss of cash availability, loss of liquidity, because of the fact that they are so limited to the types of institutions that are available, or are limited by the types of institutions that they use. Would you consider that to be true?
Yes.
Okay.
And Vicki, my question would be, what can the state do about that?
Yes.
Well, there are a couple different options. One is a business development district, and we can talk about that a little, more at length, but the New York Bank Association has partnered with several state chartered banks, and they could be nationally chartered bank. And I think just for the ease of your listenership, I just wanted to mention what the difference means. A nationally chartered bank means that any law that I pass in the state of New York relative to banking, they can't touch it. That doesn't it doesn't regulate for a federally chartered bank. So like a Chase Bank, Key Bank, Bank of America, these are big nationally chartered banks. So laws we pass, state laws that we pass in New York, aren't effective for nationally chartered banks, which is a problem, because if we want everyone to have an equal playing field, they are not overseen and regulated to some extent by laws passed in the state of New York by DFS, yes, because they're regulated to some extent, and state chartered bank like Pathfinder Bank, like credit unions, are state chartered, and we have purview to pass legislation and oversight, for those. And so there are, with the New York Bank Association, different programs that they're trying to put into the state chartered banks that are easy for residents to be able to come to have bank services, minimal kind of bank services, to say, just please come in, we'll get you a, easy account. Maybe they don't understand checking account and savings and all, but just an easy account so that they can make some sort of transactions. And they have a logo, and unfortunately I don't have that with me, what that name of that is, but they're working on that, but it's not broadly known, and it's only for state chartered banks. So if you wanted to have an account at Chase Bank, they wouldn't have that same program. So therein lies a problem with that. But these banking development districts essentially are focused on identifying areas that are underserved for low population of people, maybe that are in those vulnerable areas that I mentioned, and partnering with financial institutions to create banking districts, locations in those areas, and making that super targeted. So say in a Syracuse area, that may look like someplace on the north side where there's a high population of poverty, maybe, or it might be, someplace on the near west side or the south side. And even across the state, it could be anywhere in these rural areas, like maybe in the Adirondacks or in the, Tug Hill, where you have to travel miles and miles for banking. So trying to have a hub of banking in underserved areas to make sure, with a partner bank and helped along by the state, in order for more people to be able to be a part of conventional banking systems.
Okay. All right. So I'm curious, and you may have said this, and forgive me if I missed it. Is Syracuse, or do we have a banking development district here?
Not proper, but we have seen, especially with like a Pathfinder bank that has opened a location on that South Avenue corridor. So they were intentional, right? It's great if a bank actually does it on their own instead of actually asking, can you do this? So it was intentional on their part to say, hey, let us try to be a good corporate partner and go in there and and offer these services, because you're not going to be able to get educated on financial services if you're not starting to have that relationship. It's very hard to become a homeowner if you have not even started with the bank account. And so we need to be able to have folks kind of get educated with financial literacy and understand how this banking system works so they can be a part of it, not so that they can be tracked. Some people are very worried that, especially with the Patriot Act, people are going to want to know all their business and in their accounts. But if you want to own a home, if you want to be able to get credit, you're going to have to be part of the system in some way.
Right. Okay. And I'm glad you emphasized that. You have to be part of, I think we said this some years ago, George, you have to be part of the system in order to utilize the benefits of the system. You can't wait until you need the system in order to get involved. Okay. You need a banking relationship from day one as an individual and as a business owner. When you start your business, you need that banking relationship to develop over a very long period of time. And I'm glad, thank you very much for emphasizing that Pathfinder intentionally, without waiting, made the decision to go ahead and move forward, okay, to provide that type of service, or to at least work in that type of area. Is there something about banking? This is the last thing I wanted to ask you, unless George has something additionally. Is there something about the banking industry or banking services or banking in general that you believe that the general public misunderstands and that they really need to get a better understanding and handle on?
I think it's basic financial literacy that really escapes most people. And it really has to start at a younger age. And it is the responsibility, even though we're talking about corporations and entities that, many times have shareholders and stockholders, and, it's about the bottom line, that it really is the future of generations, the future of commerce, to make sure that young people are financially literate. And so I think people are only thinking about, you just go in and get your checking account and, you deposit your money and then you write a check or you swipe with your ATM card, and that's what banking is. But we have seen, especially with younger people now, that they can do, like I said, many transactions online. We have seen now, especially like a Venmo and PayPal.
I was just going to say that.
Now,
Yeah.
They know how to get money, that's for sure.
well, that's true, but regulations are changing. And so maybe you're a hairdresser and say, well, let me just get payments from now going forward with Venmo. Well, you're using it as a business. Are you claiming that? And, that tax implication is something that's going to happen later. Now, the tax implication is not, part of my committee, but those kind of financial institutions are the purview of the banking committee. And our young people are using that all of the time. And they're not thinking, I don't bank, I use Zelle, I use, Venmo. You are using a non-traditional type of banking service that, people are now watching, relative to regulation. And you want to make sure you're not being jammed up. So it's not just, I don't want to be a part of it. Even with insurance, you can get Rocket Mortgage, you can get the general insurance. You see all of these on commercials all of the time, where really you don't ever have to see someone face to face, but that doesn't really generally help you as you want to go along in your life and establishing credit and getting financial service products and getting a mortgage or life insurance or different things along the way. Eventually, you're going to have a one-on-one relationship, and that's where banks come in.
And that's where banks come in.
And other financial institutions, we might want to add, because you
Yeah,
did
and
mention
all of those are under the purview of
right. You
the
did
bank.
mention credit unions and things of that
Yep.
nature. And the only thing I was thinking about as you were talking about this is when you described the bank in the South Avenue corridor over there, that, just for the audience sake, that's in a community that you have described as underserved. And so that's the significance of this state chartered bank deciding to operate in that neighborhood. The other thing I was thinking about is how the state might regulate fees that the banks charge. I mean, they may or may not be able to do that, but that also could, for some people who had banking relationships, but have, maybe gotten into an issue,
Yep.
and the fees are so out of whack for what, that may prohibit them from getting a banking relationship. So
there's definitely different pieces of legislation that I know my colleagues have introduced that say that there needs to be a cap, that there shouldn't be. I have a bill that, about non-sufficient funds fees, that they crush you. And they are the ones that, people throw up their hands. It's like, I'm done, with banking, because you get yourself in a situation, in a hole where, and normally it's people who aren't able to manage their money appropriately, or they don't have a lot of money. And especially during a situation where we are now with inflation and everything is costing more, it really, has become an issue. And so that there definitely are pieces of legislation that my colleagues are, wanting to say, hey, you can't charge, this exorbitant amount of money for fees. And we're having that same conversation with some of these check cashing places that, charge for you to cash checks. And it's a percentage of the amount of check and that you have. It's not just $3 per check. It could be 3 or 2% of the total check that you're cashing.
Right.
So I have a feeling that we may have you back on, for sure.
I'm happy to
talk to your
about
people.
Specific things, because as you were talking about the check cashing, I realized that we really didn't delve much into payday loans.
Yeah.
Okay, which can become a cascade problem as far as non-traditional banking is concerned. But at this point in time, I want to make sure that we thank you thoroughly for the amount of time that you've spent with us and for giving us that complete education on at least understanding some of the basics around banking and what your committees do. Again, we were with Assemblymember Pamela J. Hunter, who is the assembly person for the District 128 of the state of New York, the great state of New York, I always say, the great state of New York. And as far as any announcements that we have for this week, George, I'll just say I'm reminding everybody that Mr. George Kilpatrick is this year's recipient of the Pioneer Public Service Award, which you were also the recipient of the Pioneer Public Service Award for some years back. He is this year's recipient, and he will receive his award on the 26th of February at the 15th annual Black History Month Jazz and Arts Cabaret, sponsored by Brackens Financial Solutions Network and in conjunction with Central New York Jazz and Arts Foundation. And I hope to see all of you there. Tickets are still available, but not for long. I checked the count today, George. It's going down really fast.
Well, listen.
So if you hesitated, or if you're hesitating, you might be left out, as I said, in the cold, because it's February.
I know that's right.
Want everybody to like, share, and subscribe. If anyone has questions, Assemblymember Hunter, can they reach out to your office?
Absolutely.
Would you like to give that information, please?
Yes. Easy 315-449-9536 or Hunter P at nyassembly.gov.
Okay.
So please like, subscribe, and share this broadcast. And if you have additional questions, reach out to Assemblymember Hunter. And George, at this point in time, I will say our plate is definitely full.
All right, Vicki Brackens and Assemblyman Pamela Hunter, we thank you both for joining us. Vicki Brackens is the president of Brackens Financial Solutions Network, LLC, and a registered representative of LPL Financial Network member SIPC. She is America's money maven.